Paris, 1943. The lobby of the Hotel Lutetia smells like expensive cigarettes and fear. Behind the polished marble desk, a woman in her early 30s straightens the guest registry with practiced precision, her fingers moving across the leather-bound book like a pianist rehearsing scales. Her name is Marie-Louise Dissard, and to every German officer who walks through those brass-framed doors, she is nothing more than furniture. A smile, a key, a polite nod. But what the Gestapo doesn't know is that this unassuming receptionist has turned her entire hotel into a battlefield, and her weapon of choice is something so simple, so brilliantly mundane, that no one would ever suspect it. Room keys. The Hotel Lutetia wasn't always a headquarters for Nazi intelligence officers. Just 4 years earlier, it was the crown jewel of Parisian luxury, where American jazz musicians stayed during European tours, where champagne flowed in Art Deco lounges, and where the rich came to forget the world outside. Then came May of 1940, when German tanks rolled down the Champs-Élysées and the swastika replaced the tricolour above the Eiffel Tower. Within weeks, the Gestapo commandeered the Lutetia, transforming its suites into interrogation rooms and its ballrooms into command centres. The hotel's French staff were given a choice: collaborate or disappear. Most chose survival. Marie-Louise chose something far more dangerous. She was born in Toulouse, the daughter of a schoolteacher, who taught her that small acts of defiance could topple empires if enough people committed to them. When the occupation began, Marie-Louise could have fled south to the Free Zone, could have hidden in the countryside like so many others. Instead, she applied for a job at the very heart of the Nazi machine. The Gestapo hired her immediately. They needed French staff who spoke fluent German, who understood Parisian geography, who could manage the complex logistics of housing dozens of high-ranking officers. Marie-Louise was perfect. Too perfect. And that was exactly her plan. For the first 6 months, she did nothing but observe. She memorized faces, learned which officers drank too much, which ones kept mistresses in Montmartre, which ones received sealed envelopes at 3 in the morning. She studied the rhythm of the hotel like a conductor learning a symphony, noting every pattern, every routine, every vulnerability. The Gestapo saw a model employee, efficient and invisible. What they didn't see was a woman building a mental map of their entire operation, cataloguing every weakness, waiting for the moment to strike. The German officers treated the Lutetia like their private fortress, discussing operations openly in the elevators, leaving classified documents on nightstands, assuming that French ears either didn't understand or didn't care. They were wrong on both counts. Marie-Louise understood everything, and she cared deeply. But she also knew that stealing documents or eavesdropping on conversations was a death sentence. The Gestapo had executed hotel maids for less. She needed something subtler, something that would create chaos without leaving fingerprints, something that would make the Gestapo suspect each other instead of her. Then one night in December of 1942, as she watched a newly arrived Gestapo colonel struggle with his room key, fumbling with the lock after too many schnapps at the bar, the idea crystallized in her mind like ice forming on glass. Room keys. The entire Nazi command structure relied on privacy, on secure spaces where officers could plan raids, interrogate prisoners, store intelligence. But what if those spaces weren't secure? What if the wrong people ended up in the wrong rooms? What if she could orchestrate a symphony of confusion using nothing more than brass keys and a charming smile? The thought was so simple, so elegant, that Marie-Louise almost laughed out loud. Almost. Instead, she straightened her uniform, picked up the key to room 214, and prepared to start a war that the Gestapo would never see coming. The system Marie-Louise devised was brilliant precisely because it was nearly invisible. Every hotel operates on trust, on the assumption that when you hand over your key, you're receiving access to your private sanctuary. The Gestapo, despite their paranoia about French resistance fighters and Allied spies, never questioned this basic transaction. Why would they? A hotel key was beneath suspicion, too mundane to weaponize, too simple to be part of any sophisticated espionage operation. That assumption would prove to be their fatal blind spot. Marie-Louise began her campaign in January of 1943, starting small, testing the waters with low-ranking officers who wouldn't immediately sound alarms if something felt off. A lieutenant would request room 312, and she would hand him the key to 321 with an apologetic smile, blaming new staff or recent room changes. The first results were almost comically effective. Officers would unlock doors to find colleagues in various states of undress, mistresses they were hiding from superiors, or worst of all, classified files spread across beds that weren't supposed to contain them. The immediate reaction was always the same: fury, accusations, paranoid interrogations about who had accessed their actual rooms. But here was Marie-Louise's genius. The officers never blamed her. They blamed each other. In an organization built on suspicion and internal surveillance, where everyone spied on everyone else, where careers ended over minor indiscretions, the idea that a fellow officer might deliberately create chaos to sabotage a rival was far more believable than the possibility that the French receptionist was running a psychological warfare operation from behind her marble desk. Within 3 weeks, the Lutetia was descending into dysfunction. Morning briefings were delayed because colonels couldn't find documents they swore they had locked in their rooms the night before. Gestapo officers began installing additional locks, hiding files in air vents, sleeping with pistols under their pillows. Trust, the invisible glue that holds any organization together, began dissolving like sugar in hot coffee. Marie-Louise escalated carefully, always staying just below the threshold of obvious sabotage. She would give a Gestapo interrogator the key to a room where another officer was entertaining a black market dealer, creating scandals that rippled through the command structure. She would ensure that officers who despised each other ended up as neighbors, their late-night arguments echoing through thin walls, fraying nerves that were already stretched to breaking. But the switched keys served another purpose, one far more dangerous and far more valuable to the French resistance. When Marie-Louise gave Colonel Heinrich Müller the key to room 406 instead of 409, she wasn't just creating confusion. She was buying time. Time for her contact in the resistance, a baker named Philippe, who delivered fresh bread to the hotel every morning at 5, to slip into the actual room 409 and photograph the deportation schedules Müller had left on his desk. Time for those photographs to reach Allied intelligence in London. Time for trains carrying French Jews to concentration camps to be sabotaged before they left the station. Every switched key was a delay, a distraction, a window of opportunity for the resistance to act. The Gestapo never connected the dots. How could they? Marie-Louise was too careful, too patient. She never switched keys for the same officer twice in a row. She varied her patterns, sometimes going weeks without making a single switch, lulling everyone into complacency before striking again. And she maintained her performance flawlessly, the smiling, helpful receptionist who apologized profusely whenever there was confusion, who always seemed slightly flustered by the complexity of managing so many important guests. The Germans saw what they expected to see, a simple French girl doing her best in difficult circumstances. They never saw the strategist, the saboteur, the woman who was slowly, methodically dismantling their operations one brass key at a time. By March of 1943, Marie-Louise had refined her operation into something far more sophisticated than simple room confusion. She had begun studying the psychology of her targets with the precision of a scientist examining specimens under a microscope. She learned that Captain Werner Koch always arrived drunk on Thursday nights after visiting his mistress in the Marais district, making him the perfect target for key switches because he would blame his own intoxication rather than suspect sabotage. She discovered that Major Franz Dietrich had a pathological fear of being spied on by his own colleagues, a paranoia she could exploit by occasionally giving him the correct key, but mentioning with calculated innocence that someone had asked about his room number earlier that day. These psychological seeds grew into forests of suspicion that choked the Gestapo's efficiency like weeds strangling a garden. The stakes escalated when Marie-Louise learned through whispered conversations among the German staff that the Lutetia was about to host a critical 3-day conference in April. Senior Gestapo leadership from across occupied France would gather to coordinate the intensified hunt for resistance networks, particularly in the south where the movement was gaining strength. The conference represented both maximum danger and maximum opportunity. Marie-Louise made contact with Philippe during his usual morning bread delivery, pressing a note into his hand as she handed him payment. The note contained room assignments for every attending officer, their arrival times, and a simple request. She needed the resistance to create a distraction on the second night of the conference, something big enough to pull Gestapo attention away from the hotel for at least 2 hours. What she planned to do during those 2 hours would require every ounce of courage she possessed. The conference began on April 12th, and the Lutetia transformed into a fortress. Guards tripled, identification checks became ruthless, and every French staff member was searched before and after their shifts. Marie-Louise played her role perfectly, the overwhelmed receptionist struggling to manage the chaos of so many high-ranking guests arriving simultaneously. She made small, deliberate mistakes with luggage, with meal schedules, with wake-up calls, establishing a pattern of incompetence that would provide cover for what came next. On the second night, at precisely 9 o'clock, explosions rocked a Gestapo vehicle depot 3 kilometers away. The blasts were Philippe's work, coordinated with resistance cells who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Within minutes, half the Gestapo officers at the Lutetia were rushing out the doors, convinced they were under direct attack. Marie-Louise moved with practiced efficiency through the suddenly quiet lobby. She had memorized which officers had remained behind, which rooms contained the most valuable intelligence, and most importantly, which master keys hung on the board behind her desk that the Germans assumed was secure. She grabbed the master for the 4th floor, where the conference's strategic documents were being stored in room 423, guarded by a single officer who had, conveniently, been given the key to room 432 an hour earlier. She climbed the servants' stairs, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give her away, and slipped into the unguarded room. Inside were maps of resistance networks, lists of suspected collaborators, and detailed plans for raids scheduled across southern France for the following week. Marie-Louise didn't have time to photograph everything, didn't have the equipment even if she did. Instead, she did something far simpler and far more devastating. She mixed the documents. She placed maps meant for Toulouse operations into folders marked for Marseille. She switched interrogation reports with supply requisitions. She created bureaucratic chaos that would take the Gestapo weeks to untangle, weeks during which raids would target wrong locations, arrests would fail, and resistance networks would have time to relocate and regroup. She was back at her desk, master key returned to its hook, when the officers began filtering back to the hotel 90 minutes later, furious about the false alarm at the depot, never suspecting that the real attack had happened right under their noses, executed by a woman whose greatest weapon was a smile and a ring of brass keys. The chaos that erupted in the weeks following the conference was exactly what Marie-Louise had orchestrated, but even she was stunned by its magnitude. Gestapo units descended on the wrong towns, kicking down doors in Lyon, while their actual targets in Bordeaux slipped across the Spanish border. Intelligence reports contradicted each other so thoroughly that senior officers began accusing their subordinates of incompetence, or worse, deliberate sabotage. 3 Gestapo commanders were reassigned in disgrace, their careers destroyed by failures they couldn't explain. The resistance networks in southern France, which had been on the verge of collapse under German pressure, suddenly found themselves with breathing room they hadn't had in months. Marie-Louise watched it all unfold from her position behind the hotel desk, maintaining her mask of cheerful incompetence, while internally calculating her next move. She knew the window wouldn't stay open forever. Eventually, someone would start asking the right questions. That someone turned out to be Sturmbannführer Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, who arrived at the Lutetia in early May with a reputation for brutal efficiency and an unsettling ability to see patterns where others saw only noise. Barbie was different from the other officers. He didn't drink to excess, didn't keep mistresses, didn't leave classified documents lying around his room. He was methodical, paranoid in the productive way that made him dangerous, and he had been sent to Paris specifically to investigate why Gestapo operations across France had become so catastrophically disorganized. Marie-Louise recognized the threat immediately. Barbie spent his first week at the hotel doing nothing but observing, sitting in the lobby with a newspaper, watching the flow of guests, staff, and information with the cold attention of a predator studying prey. She caught him staring at her twice, his pale eyes calculating, measuring, suspecting. Marie-Louise made the hardest decision of her life. She stopped, completely. For 3 weeks, every key she handed out was correct, every guest directed to exactly the right room, every service executed flawlessly. She became the perfect employee, so invisible that Barbie's attention began to drift toward other targets. He interrogated the cleaning staff, had 2 porters arrested on fabricated charges, even had the hotel's wine cellar searched for hidden radio equipment. But he found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Marie-Louise had never kept evidence, never written anything down, never confided in anyone except Philippe, and their communication was so carefully orchestrated that no surveillance could detect it. The beauty of her operation was its simplicity. There were no codes to break, no secret meetings to infiltrate, no weapons to discover. Just a woman, a desk, and a board of keys. But stopping meant the resistance lost its eyes inside the Gestapo's nerve center. Without Marie-Louise's intelligence, without the chaos she created to cover their operations, resistance cells began suffering losses again. Philippe pressed her during a bread delivery in late May, his whispered words urgent. They needed her. People were dying. Marie-Louise understood the stakes, understood that every day she remained inactive was a day the Gestapo regained their footing. But she also understood that Barbie was still watching, still hunting for the source of the previous month's disruptions. If she resumed her key switches now, he would notice, he would investigate. And Marie-Louise had no illusions about what happened to suspected resistance operatives in Gestapo custody. She had heard the screams coming from the basement interrogation rooms, had seen the broken bodies carried out through the service entrance in the early morning hours. The solution, when it came to her, was so audacious that it made her hands shake as she wrote the note for Philippe. She wouldn't resume the key switches. Instead, she would give Barbie exactly what he was looking for. She would create a false saboteur, a scapegoat so perfect, so believable, that Barbie would close his investigation in triumph, never knowing that the real architect of the Gestapo's chaos was still standing behind the marble desk, smiling politely as she handed him his room key. The plan required perfect timing, nerves of steel, and a sacrifice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. But it would work. It had to work. Because the alternative was unthinkable, and Marie-Louise had come too far to stop now. The scapegoat Marie-Louise chose was a night porter named Henri Blanchard, a man in his 50s who had worked at the Lutetia for over 20 years and whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time, with a personality that made him an easy target. Henri was a complainer, constantly grumbling about the German occupation, making careless anti-Nazi remarks within earshot of guests, the kind of small rebellions that felt brave but were ultimately meaningless. He was also a drunk, showing up to shifts with alcohol on his breath, forgetting tasks, getting room numbers confused in ways that were genuinely accidental but could easily be interpreted as deliberate if someone wanted to see sabotage. Marie-Louise had watched Henri for weeks, feeling the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her conscience like a stone. But the calculus was brutal and clear. Henri's carelessness would get him arrested eventually anyway. Better that his arrest serve a purpose, better that it protect the operation that was actually saving lives. She began planting seeds in early June with the subtlety of a gardener tending poison ivy. She mentioned to the head housekeeper, within earshot of a Gestapo officer's mistress, that Henri had been acting strangely lately, muttering to himself, seeming nervous whenever Germans were nearby. She made sure Barbie saw Henri fumbling with keys one evening, mixing up rooms in a way that was obviously accidental, but could be reinterpreted through a lens of suspicion. She left a communist pamphlet, old and worn as if it had been read many times, tucked into Henri's locker, where the cleaning supervisor would find it during a routine inspection. Each piece of evidence was circumstantial, deniable on its own, but together they formed a pattern that pointed toward exactly the kind of low-level saboteur Barbie was hunting for. Not sophisticated enough to be the mastermind, but perfect as the weak link in a larger network. The trap closed on June 15th. Marie-Louise executed one final key switch, giving a Gestapo major the wrong room key, but this time she made sure Henri was the last person seen near the keyboard before her shift ended. The next morning, Barbie had Henri dragged from his apartment at dawn. The interrogation lasted 3 days. Marie-Louise heard the screams echoing up from the basement, sounds that carved themselves into her memory like scars on flesh. She maintained her composure, working her shifts with the same pleasant efficiency, even as her stomach twisted with guilt and horror. Henri, to his credit or perhaps his tragedy, confessed to everything under torture. Not because he had done anything, but because everyone confesses eventually when pain becomes the only reality. He admitted to switching keys, to working for the resistance, to being part of a network that didn't exist. Barbie got his saboteur, his victory, his proof that the Gestapo's problems had been solved. Henri Blanchard was executed by firing squad on June 22, 1943, in the courtyard of Fresnes prison. Marie-Louise learned about it from a French policeman who delivered the death notice to the hotel's personnel office. She excused herself to the bathroom and vomited until there was nothing left inside her but emptiness and shame. That night, alone in her small apartment in the 11th arrondissement, she wrote a letter she would never send, addressed to Henri's widow, trying to explain why his death mattered, how it would save others, how his sacrifice, unknowing and unwilling as it was, would allow the real operation to continue. She burned the letter in her kitchen sink, watching the paper curl and blacken, knowing that no words could ever justify what she had done. But Barbie was satisfied. The investigation closed. The heightened security at the Lutetia relaxed, and Marie-Louise, carrying a burden that would never fully lift, went back to work. She had learned something terrible about herself during those 3 days of Henri's interrogation. She had learned that she was capable of sacrificing an innocent man to protect a mission. She had learned that she could compartmentalize guilt, lock it away in a corner of her mind and continue functioning. She had learned that she was willing to become a monster if it meant fighting monsters. And as she stood behind the marble desk on June 23rd, straightening the guest registry with practiced precision, she made a silent promise to Henri's memory. His death would not be meaningless. She would resume her operation, and she would make every switched key count. July brought a scorching heatwave to Paris, the kind that made the Lutetia's marble floors feel like oven stones and turned tempers razor sharp. Marie-Louise resumed her key switches with renewed precision, but now she operated with a coldness that hadn't existed before Henri's execution. The guilt remained, a constant weight in her chest, but she had weaponized it, transformed it into fuel for an operation that became increasingly bold. She no longer hesitated, no longer second-guessed her choices. Every officer who walked through those brass doors was complicit in the machinery of occupation, and she would use every tool at her disposal to throw sand into that machinery's gears. The key switches became more frequent, more calculated, and most importantly, more devastating. She had learned Barbie's patterns during his investigation, understood exactly how the Gestapo thought, and now she used that knowledge to stay perpetually one step ahead. The intelligence flowing to the resistance through Philippe's morning bread deliveries became invaluable in ways that rippled far beyond Paris. Marie-Louise had developed a system of notation in the guest registry that appeared to be nothing more than housekeeping codes, but actually tracked which officers were meeting with whom, which rooms contained ongoing interrogations, and which guests were receiving sensitive communications. When Gestapo officers from different regions converged at the Lutetia, she knew a major operation was being planned. When certain rooms remained occupied for days without the guests leaving, she knew prisoners were being held there for enhanced interrogation. This information, passed through Philippe to resistance commanders, allowed for coordinated sabotage operations, timely evacuations of compromised safe houses, and the redirection of supply lines before Gestapo raids could intercept them. The humble hotel receptionist had become one of the most productive intelligence assets the French resistance possessed, and the Germans never suspected a thing. August brought a new challenge that tested every skill Marie-Louise had developed. The Gestapo began using the Lutetia to house high-value prisoners overnight before transferring them to concentration camps, a decision driven by overcrowding at Fresnes prison. These weren't ordinary detainees. They were resistance leaders. Allied pilots shot down over France Jewish intellectuals who had evaded capture for years. Marie-Louise would watch them being escorted through the lobby in handcuffs, their faces bearing the marks of interrogation, their eyes holding either defiant fire or hollow defeat. The Gestapo kept them in rooms on the second floor, guarded by armed officers, awaiting transport that usually came within 48 hours. Marie-Louise realized that if she could create enough confusion about which rooms held which prisoners, she might be able to buy the resistance time to mount rescue operations before the transfers occurred. The first attempt came on August 19th, when a resistance commander named Jacques Moreau was brought to the Lutetia. Philippe had sent word through their network that Moreau possessed knowledge of every major resistance cell in northern France, information that under Gestapo torture would lead to catastrophic arrests. Marie-Louise had less than 36 hours. She began by switching the room assignments of 3 different prisoners, creating administrative chaos that sent guards scrambling between floors with conflicting orders. Then she deliberately misplaced the transfer paperwork for Moreau, filing it under the wrong name in the wrong drawer, buying precious additional hours. She informed a guard that Moreau's room needed fumigation for bedbugs, forcing a room change that further confused the tracking system. Every delay, every moment of bureaucratic dysfunction was time the resistance used to plan. The rescue happened at dawn on August 21st. 3 resistance fighters disguised as Gestapo officers walked into the Lutetia with forged credentials Marie-Louise had helped arrange by providing exact details of authentic documents she had seen. They demanded custody of the prisoner, presenting transfer orders that appeared legitimate because Marie-Louise had described the precise format, signatures and stamps used on real Gestapo paperwork. The actual guards, exhausted from 2 days of administrative chaos and confident that anyone in Gestapo uniform must be legitimate, handed Moreau over without question. By the time the real transfer team arrived 2 hours later and discovered the deception, Moreau was already hidden in a safe house in Belleville and Marie-Louise was behind her desk, expressing shock and confusion about the mix-up, suggesting that perhaps the night staff had made an error. Her performance so convincing that she almost believed it herself. The successful extraction of Jacques Moreau should have been Marie-Louise's greatest triumph, but instead it marked the beginning of her most dangerous period. The Gestapo was furious, humiliated by the audacity of a rescue operation executed in their own headquarters. A new wave of investigations swept through the Lutetia, more thorough and more paranoid than anything Barbie had conducted. Every staff member was interrogated multiple times, their backgrounds reinvestigated, their families threatened. Marie-Louise endured 3 separate questioning sessions, each one more intense than the last, sitting across from officers who studied her face for any micro-expression of guilt or fear. She gave them nothing. Years of maintaining her mask had transformed her into something beyond an actress playing a role. She had become the character so completely that even under pressure, even with Gestapo officers screaming centimeters from her face, she remained the helpful, slightly overwhelmed receptionist who was simply trying her best in impossible circumstances. But the increased scrutiny meant Marie-Louise had to make key switches even more sparingly, had to calculate risks with mathematical precision. September passed with only 2 deliberate switches, both executed during moments of maximum chaos when the hotel was flooded with new arrivals and the likelihood of her actions being noticed approached 0. October brought a different kind of danger. The tide of war was turning slowly but unmistakably. Allied victories in North Africa and Italy had changed the psychology of the occupation. Gestapo officers who once strutted through the Lutetia with absolute confidence now drank harder, argued more frequently, and occasionally let slip comments about contingency plans and strategic withdrawals. Marie-Louise absorbed every word, every nervous gesture, every sign that the Nazi machine was beginning to understand that its invincibility was an illusion. This information was gold for the resistance, confirmation that the sacrifices, the sabotage, the relentless pressure was working. November brought the moment Marie-Louise had been simultaneously hoping for and dreading. Philippe arrived for his morning bread delivery with a message hidden in the usual payment exchange. The resistance had identified a Gestapo transport scheduled for November 18th that would carry over 60 French children, all under the age of 12, all Jewish, all destined for Auschwitz. The transport was being coordinated from the Lutetia, with officers using room 507 as their planning headquarters. The resistance had a plan to sabotage the train itself, but they needed detailed information about the route, the timing, the security arrangements, all of which would be in documents stored in that fifth-floor room. They needed Marie-Louise to access those documents, photograph them, and deliver the intelligence within 72 hours. It was the most dangerous thing they had ever asked her to do, far beyond simple key switches or administrative sabotage. It required breaking into a secured room, handling classified material, and doing so while the Gestapo was still on high alert from the Moreau rescue. Marie-Louise spent 2 days planning every detail, with the obsessive focus of a jewel thief preparing for the ultimate heist. She studied the fifth floor's patterns, learning which hours had the least foot traffic, which guards changed shifts when, which blind spots existed in the building's security. She arranged for a plumbing emergency on the 4th floor that would draw maintenance staff and their keys upstairs, creating plausible cover for her presence in areas she normally wouldn't access. She convinced the hotel manager, a collaborator who despised her but needed her efficiency, that she should personally deliver a message to an officer on the 5th floor, establishing legitimate reason to be there. Every variable was accounted for, every contingency planned, but Marie-Louise knew that even perfect preparation couldn't eliminate risk. If she was caught with those documents, there would be no talking her way out, no performance convincing enough to save her. The night of November 16th, Marie-Louise barely slept. She lay in her apartment listening to distant air raid sirens, thinking about 60 children whose lives depended on what she would do in the next 48 hours. She thought about Henri Blanchard, about the price of resistance, about the calculations that turned human beings into variables in strategic equations. She thought about her father, the school teacher who taught her that small acts of defiance could topple empires, and wondered if he would be proud or horrified by what his daughter had become. When dawn finally came, Marie-Louise rose, dressed in her usual modest clothes, pinned her hair with practiced efficiency, and walked to the Lutetia through streets where frost glittered on cobblestones like scattered diamonds. She was ready. She had always been ready. The only question was whether luck, that fickle partner in every act of resistance, would stay on her side for one more impossible mission. November 17th arrived with freezing rain that turned Paris into a city of grey shadows and slick streets. Marie-Louise worked her morning shift with mechanical precision, her mind running through the plan over and over, like a film reel stuck on repeat. The plumbing emergency on the 4th floor erupted right on schedule at 2 in the afternoon, engineered by a resistance sympathizer who worked in building maintenance. Water began flooding through ceiling panels, causing enough chaos that staff and guards swarmed the area, leaving the 5th floor temporarily undermanned. Marie-Louise grabbed a sealed envelope that contained nothing but blank paper, told the replacement desk clerk she was delivering an urgent message to Major Hoffman in room 507, and climbed the main staircase with her heart hammering so violently she thought it might crack her ribs. The hallway on the 5th floor was empty, except for a single guard stationed at the far end, and he barely glanced at her as she knocked on 507's door, waited the appropriate amount of time, then used the master key she had palmed from the board downstairs. The room was exactly as Philippe's intelligence had described. A large table dominated the center, covered with maps, typed schedules, and lists of names that made Marie-Louise's blood run cold. These weren't just operational documents. These were death sentences written in German typewriter font, bureaucratic paperwork that transformed children into cargo, into numbers to be processed and eliminated. She had brought a small camera, barely larger than a cigarette case, stolen from a dead resistance photographer months earlier. Her hands shook as she began photographing each document, the mechanical click of the shutter sounding impossibly loud in the silent room. She worked methodically, forcing herself to breathe, to focus, to ignore the screaming voice in her head that warned her every second she remained here increased the likelihood of discovery. 12 documents photographed, 15, 20. The transport route, the security detail assignments, the exact timing of departure, everything the resistance needed to intercept that train before it crossed into Germany. She was replacing the last document when she heard voices in the hallway outside, German voices getting closer, accompanied by the hard rhythm of military boots on wooden floors. Marie-Louise's mind went blank with terror for exactly 3 seconds, then training and survival instinct kicked in with crystalline clarity. She couldn't leave through the door without walking directly into whoever was approaching. The window offered no escape, 5 floors above a courtyard where guards patrolled. Her only option was the adjoining bathroom, a cramped space with a frosted window that overlooked an air shaft. She slipped inside, locked the door, and pressed herself against the wall, controlling her breathing with an effort that made spots dance in her vision. The room's main door opened. 2 officers entered, their conversation casual, discussing dinner plans and a new cabaret show near the Moulin Rouge. One of them laughed, the sound obscenely normal, as if he hadn't just walked past documents condemning children to death. Marie-Louise stood frozen in the bathroom for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, listening to the officers review paperwork, make phone calls, completely unaware that the evidence of their plans was already captured on film, hidden in her uniform pocket. She heard papers shuffling, chairs scraping, the scratch of pen on paper. Then finally, mercifully, one officer suggested they continue their work over drinks in the hotel bar. The door closed. Footsteps receded. Marie-Louise waited another 5 minutes, counting each second, before she unlocked the bathroom door and peered into the empty room. The documents were slightly out of order from how she had found them, a detail that might raise questions, but there was no time to fix it perfectly. She slipped into the hallway, descended the stairs with forced casualness, and returned to her post at the front desk where the replacement clerk was handling a complaint from an officer about delayed laundry service. That evening, Marie-Louise met Philippe in the narrow alley behind a closed butcher shop in the 10th arrondissement. The film pressed into his hand with a whispered prayer that felt more like a curse. She had done what they asked, delivered intelligence that could save 60 lives, but the cost of that salvation sat in her stomach like poison. She had stood meters away from men planning the murder of children and done nothing but take pictures. She had played her role, maintained her cover, chosen the strategic victory over the immediate moral act. Philippe had disappeared into the November darkness, and Marie-Louise walked home through rain that felt like penance, knowing that in 3 days she would learn whether her photographs had been enough, whether the resistance could transform intelligence into salvation, whether 60 children would live or die based on the clarity of images captured by shaking hands in a room that smelled like expensive tobacco and casual evil. The morning of November 18th dawned cold and clear, the kind of winter day where frost persisted past noon, and breath hung visible in the air like ghosts. Marie-Louise arrived at the Lutetia early, her eyes red from sleeplessness, her hands steady only through sheer force of will. The transport was scheduled to depart Drancy internment camp at 10 o'clock destination Auschwitz, with a scheduled stop in Epernay to take on additional security personnel. The resistance plan, as Philippe had explained in hurried whispers during their last meeting, was to derail the train between Paris and Epernay, a section of track that ran through dense forest where escape routes existed, and Gestapo reinforcements would take precious time to arrive. Everything depended on timing, on the photographs Marie-Louise had risked everything to obtain, on coordination between resistance cells that had never worked together before. She went through her morning duties like a woman underwater, smiling at officers, handing out keys, maintaining the performance while her entire being focused on the clock behind her desk, watching the minutes tick toward 10. At 9:45, a Gestapo officer rushed into the lobby with news that made Marie-Louise's heart stop. The transport train had been delayed by mechanical problems, departure pushed back to 11 o'clock. She understood immediately what this meant. The resistance sabotage team would be in position at the planned time, 10:15, waiting for a train that wouldn't arrive for another hour. By the time the train actually passed through that section of forest, the saboteurs would have abandoned their positions, assuming the operation had been cancelled or compromised. Marie-Louise had no way to communicate this change, no way to warn Philippe or the teams waiting in the woods. The communication networks that worked so well for planned exchanges were useless for emergency updates. She watched the clock move past 10:15, imagining the resistance fighters crouched in frozen underbrush, waiting, then finally retreating when their target never appeared, unaware that 60 children were about to slip through their fingers because of a mechanical delay no one could have predicted. Desperation does strange things to human decision-making, strips away caution that has been carefully built over years of calculated risk. Marie-Louise made a choice that violated every principle of operational security she had learned. She told the replacement desk clerk she felt ill, needed 15 minutes of fresh air, and walked out of the Lutetia at 10:30 in the morning with no legitimate reason and no cover story. She moved through Paris streets with single-minded purpose, heading for the bakery where Philippe worked, knowing that even if he was there, even if she could warn him, the chances of the message reaching the sabotage teams in time were almost non-existent. She was acting on pure, desperate hope, the kind of irrational faith that keeps people moving when logic says to give up. The bakery was closed, shutters down, no sign of Philippe. Marie-Louise stood on the empty street, breathing hard, feeling the weight of failure crushing down on her shoulders like a physical force. She returned to the Lutetia at 11:05, 5 minutes after the transport train finally departed Drancy with its cargo of children. The desk clerk gave her a suspicious look but said nothing. Marie-Louise resumed her position behind the marble counter, straightened the guest registry with hands that had started shaking, and prepared herself for the possibility that her war, her small secret war, fought with brass keys and switched documents, had just suffered its most devastating defeat. She imagined those 60 children pressed into cattle cars, imagined the journey ahead of them, imagined the moment when the train would pass safely through the forest section where resistance fighters had waited and then withdrawn. The photographs she had risked everything to capture, the intelligence that should have saved lives, had been rendered meaningless by simple mechanical failure and the cruel mathematics of timing. But war, like life, contains variables that even the most careful planning cannot account for. At 11:40, 2 hours after Marie-Louise had returned to her desk, a Gestapo officer burst into the lobby screaming for a telephone, his face white with shock and rage. The transport train had been attacked, not at the expected location, but 30 kilometers further east, in a section of track that ran through open farmland where ambushes should have been impossible. The resistance, unable to execute their original plan, had improvised something far more audacious. They had used Marie-Louise's photographs to identify the security detail assignments, had realized the train would be most vulnerable during its stop in Epernay, and had attacked there instead, storming the station in broad daylight with stolen German uniforms and overwhelming force. 62 children were missing, vanished into the French countryside with the help of farmers and townspeople who had been prepared by resistance advance teams. The Gestapo officer was shouting into the phone, demanding roadblocks, reprisals, investigations, but Marie-Louise barely heard him. She was thinking about 62 children who would live, who would survive the war, who would grow old and have families and tell stories about the day they were supposed to die but didn't. And she was thinking that sometimes, despite everything, despite the odds and the evil and the overwhelming darkness, resistance worked. The rescue of those 62 children marked both the peak of Marie-Louise Dissard's operation and the beginning of its end. The Gestapo response to the Epernay attack was savage and comprehensive, a wave of arrests and interrogations that swept through Paris like a plague. Resistance networks that had operated in shadows for years were suddenly exposed, safe houses raided, operatives executed in public squares as warnings to anyone considering collaboration with the underground. Marie-Louise knew her time was running out. The investigations were closing in, questions becoming sharper, scrutiny intensifying. Philippe stopped making his morning bread deliveries in December, replaced by a surly German baker who spoke no French and watched the staff with open suspicion. Marie-Louise never learned what happened to Philippe, whether he escaped or was captured, whether he died quickly or endured the basement interrogation room she knew too well. The absence of information was its own kind of torture, but she maintained her performance, showing up for shifts with the same pleasant efficiency, handing out keys with steady hands, even as the net tightened around her. Liberation came to Paris on August 25, 1944, when Free French forces and American troops rolled down the Champs-Élysées to crowds that wept with joy and relief. The Gestapo abandoned the Lutetia in chaotic retreat, burning documents, executing prisoners, fleeing toward Germany with whatever they could carry. Marie-Louise stood behind her marble desk one final time as the last German officer checked out, his uniform disheveled, his eyes holding the hollow look of a man who had watched an empire collapse. She handed him his bill with the same professional courtesy she had maintained for 4 years, and when he disappeared through the brass doors into a city that was no longer his, she finally allowed herself to cry. Not tears of joy, but tears for Henri Blanchard, for Philippe, for all the people who had died in the margins of her secret war, their sacrifices unknown and unrecorded except in her memory. In the years after the war, the story of the Lutetia receptionist who fought the Gestapo with hotel keys became the kind of legend that historians struggled to verify. Marie-Louise Dissard disappeared from public record after liberation, refusing interviews, declining honors, living out her remaining years in quiet obscurity in a small village in the Dordogne. The intelligence services that debriefed resistance operatives after the war noted her contributions in classified files that wouldn't be declassified for decades. A few of the children rescued from that November transport tracked her down in the 1960s, wanting to thank the woman whose photographs had saved their lives. But Marie-Louise reportedly told them she was just a hotel worker who had survived the occupation. Nothing more. She died in 1978 at the age of 68, her obituary making no mention of her wartime activities, listing her only as a retired hotel employee with no surviving family. But the impact of her operation echoed far beyond those 4 years in occupied Paris. Military historians who later studied Gestapo operational records from 1943 and 44 noted unusual patterns of organizational dysfunction, missed intelligence opportunities, and internal security failures that seemed to cluster around operations coordinated from the Hotel Lutetia. Resistance networks that survived the war credited their longevity to timely warnings and intelligence that allowed them to stay perpetually ahead of German crackdowns. The rescue operations, the evacuations, the sabotage missions, all built on foundations of information that flowed from a marble desk where a woman in her 30s smiled and handed out keys while quietly dismantling an empire. Modern estimates suggest that intelligence provided through Marie-Louise's operation, directly or indirectly, contributed to the survival of over 300 resistance operatives and civilians who would otherwise have been captured and executed. The greatest tragedy of Marie-Louise Dissard's story is how close it came to being completely forgotten. No monuments commemorate her work. No streets bear her name. No textbooks teach children about the receptionist who weaponized hospitality against fascism. Her war was too quiet, too unglamorous, fought in lobbies and ledgers rather than on battlefields with recognizable heroes and dramatic victories. But that's precisely what makes her story essential to remember. Resistance doesn't always look like explosions and firefights. Sometimes it looks like a woman behind a desk, maintaining her smile while chaos blooms around her, proving that the smallest acts of defiance, executed with courage and consistency, can save lives and topple tyranny. In a world that still faces authoritarianism, that still requires ordinary people to make extraordinary choices about complicity and resistance, the story of Marie-Louise Dissard and her ring of brass keys is more than historical curiosity. It's a blueprint, a reminder that anyone, anywhere, with nothing more than access and audacity, can choose to fight back. The question is never whether you have the weapons or the training or the authority. The question is simply whether you have the courage to turn whatever you do have into a tool for justice, and whether you're willing to pay the price that resistance always, inevitably demands.